Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great honour, and thanks for arranging this very interesting panel, though I'm afraid you're not likely to be entertained by a huge amount of political disagreement between myself and Phil and Hilary. I thought it might be more entertaining if I pretended to be a sort of radical liberal who thinks that the liberation of the individual from the bonds of community is the greatest achievement of Western modernity. Begin by thinking about is simply this: what kind of communities can act? In other words, what are the conditions of possibility for any form of collective agency whatsoever, and for whatever specific type of a collective agency we may be able to identify at work in contemporary culture? I'd like to think about them. I've got no intention of answering them. So I realise, having read through the paper, this is a very general and abstract way of framing the question, but I think that in quite concrete terms, the current political and cultural situation in which we find ourselves demands some such formulation, because I think one of the specific characteristics of neoliberalism is its tendency to work to undermine the possibility of any form of collective agency whatsoever. Now, arguably, this isn't a unique feature of neoliberalism. Arguably, it's typical of capitalism in general and of the liberal tradition, with its fetishisation of individual property rights over any form of democratic or communitarian entitlements since the 17th century. But I think historically neoliberalism emerged as a key elite project, at least partly in response to a proliferation and eruption of collective demands along new axes, gender, race, youth, etc., and has worked with particular assiduousness to neutralise not just those demands, but most of the forms of institutionalised democracy and collectivity which emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries in response to the dislocation of traditional institutions and communities by capitalist modernisation. If neoliberalism, as Harvey's famous account demonstrates, is primarily a project to restore the class power of finance capital, which I think it is, then it's notable from this perspective that the enemies that it has had to overcome, neutralise or disperse in that process in order to achieve that goal have not purely been class enemies, but have rather included any kind of collective which might be capable of acting together, taking decisions and intervening in the world in order to implement those decisions. So feminism, for example, as commentators like Diane Negra, Angela McRobbie, Nancy Fraser and others have shown in different ways, is tolerated by neoliberalism precisely to the extent that it does not constitute itself as a collective movement making social and economic demands on the wider society, but confines itself to being a project for the equalisation of individual access to the labour market and opportunities for private self-expression. I think this is just one example, there are many others, of the ways in which neoliberalism works against the emergence or persistence of any form of what I call potent collectivity, meaning any form of collectivity, a collective entity capable of acting in the world. Neoliberalism tries to substitute any form of potent collectivity with what we might call the impotent collectivity of pure market relations, which constitutes a form of distributed decision making, but one in which intentional collective decision making as such is rendered constitutively impossible. I recognise there are potentially gendered implications to some of this language, but I'd like to try to detach notions of potency from any sexual implication. Now, how such, and for me this notion of potent collectivity is very important to any understanding of democracy as such. I think it's really extraordinary. I mean, when I was working on my last book, a book called Common Ground, ironically, I mean, one of the things that was really striking is very little of the sort of political science literature on democracy actually concerned itself with an idea of democracy as collective decision making, as the capacity of collectives actually to enact decisions they might make together, which to me seems to be absolutely central to any conception of democracy. The democracy on any scale has to facilitate the emergence of what I'm calling potent collectivities. Now, how such potent collectivities are conceptualised is arguably a key question for social, political and cultural theory. In the case to which I just referred, the case of feminism, I think we can make a useful distinction between the idea of feminism as a project for the liberation of individual women and the idea of the women's movement as such. I think it's worth reflecting, for example, that anti-feminist discourse and imagery since the 70s largely draws on a repertoire of caricatures of the women's movement, rather than trying to comment in any way on feminism's abstract claims. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's often invited students to tell me whether they identified as feminists and then admonishing them for failing to do so. I mean, I've this spiel that I've done sort of every year with some group of students or other for 20 years, where I say, how many of you would call yourself a feminist? They'll say no. Then I say, well, there's 3 statements you've got to tell me which ones you don't agree with, that women have been historically subjugated, that that's a bad thing, and that therefore we should do something about it. And they all say, yes, we agree with all those statements. And I say, well, you're a feminist then. But, of course, it was only after years of doing this that I properly realised that what the students were telling me was that they concurred with the abstract goals of feminism as a kind of liberal feminism, as a liberal project, but could not identify with the women's movement as a historical phenomenon. And I think it's the fact that it's the movement rather than its goals which has been the historic object of symbolic attack is quite telling here. So I'm implicitly positing here a distinction between a project and a movement, or perhaps I'm positing a nomenclature according to which every movement would be, to some extent, a project, but not every project would be a movement. And of course, this immediately raises the question of what exactly it is that constitutes a movement as such. Now, this is something which various social movement theorists have debated over the years, which doesn't have any widely accepted answer. I strongly advise colleagues who may be tempted to avoid straying into the social movement theorist territory if they can at all help it, because they don't like trespassers. But movement is clearly one name for a particular type or range of types of potent collectivity. We can think of many other such names, none of which really we'll have time to think about here: nation, people, multitude, class, bloc, party. And I do have some sympathy with those social movement theorists who try to impose quite a rigorous set of criteria for establishing the existence of a movement. Partly because I think in media and cultural studies we have our own history of such terms becoming attenuated to the point of meaninglessness. I'm thinking about the kind of emptying out of the category of subculture, especially over the course of the 90s. Subculture ended up being a term for any group of people who happen to like the same stuff for a couple of hours a week. And I think the problem with distinguishing and defining subcultures, movements, etc., it is clearly a kind of ongoing one for all these kinds of theorisation. You know, whenever I think about this, I'm reminded of the time when I was personally studied by some Italian sociologists as a supposed representative of the British anti-capitalist movement. Chantal Mouffe had told these. She said, "Oh, he's some sort of activist. Get in touch with him." And so I was sort of sat in a room in SOAS, being sort of focus group for 3 hours, and they absolutely hated me because they kept they kept saying, "We want to know how you feel." And I kept saying, "I feel frustrated at our inability to constitute an effective counter-hegemonic strategy." They didn't want to know about that. And I said to them, and really they hated me because I said to them, look, there is no anti-capitalist movement in Britain. Like, there's about 300 people who've been turning up to the same demonstrations for the past 10 years. Like, I know nearly all of them. Like, we're not a movement. We're just a bunch of people. And they really didn't want to hear that. But the question of what defines a movement and what a movement is for has a very significant resonance in contemporary British politics, because debates around Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party in fact hinge almost entirely on the question of what it means to be part of a political movement, and what the function, and what the proper relationship should be between a movement, a party, and a wider public. In fact, to be specific, the most contentious aspect of these debates has hinged on the deliberate attempt of some of Corbyn's supporters to transform the campaign to elect him as party leader into a political movement for wider change to both party and country. Now, this situation introduces another key distinguishing term here into the lexicon of potent collectivities: the campaign. Now, this might sound like a relatively unimportant term, but even before the emergence of Corbynism, I'd come to realise over the past couple of years of working on various political education projects with mostly younger activists, that the distinction between a campaign and a movement is a very important one, and the inability to make it is often a disabling feature of contemporary activist discourse. particularly in the NGO sector, which is where the people I've worked with most closely are kind of based. So how do I understand this distinction between a campaign and a movement, and why does it matter? Put simply, I'd argue that a campaign is generally very specific about its immediate goals, upon which it's almost exclusively focused, that its addressees are always specifically either a key set of decision makers or a general public, and that as such its mode of address must always be immediately accessible to these audiences. A movement, on the other hand, will always contain campaigning elements, but an important element of its collective practice will also be working to create a sense of collective coherence, if not necessarily collective identity as such, and to some extent a distinctive shared culture for the movement itself. So in discussions around political education, for example, with various kind of radical networks I've been involved with over the past couple of years, the status of political jargon, for example, comes up again and again, and there's a kind of commonsensical rejection. There tends to be kind of commonsensical rejection of any deployment of jargon or any kind of theoretical terminology from people who come from a purely campaigning background. And the point I find myself making kind of repeatedly is that actually most of the jargon they went to reject is itself a legacy of movement struggles. It was part of the language which movements developed in order to make sense of the world. And that in fact part of what it means to be in a movement is partly you do develop specific perspectives, you innovate linguistically. So it's not the same thing as just sort of winning over people who've never heard of you before. Now, in the case of these debates around the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, this distinction between movement and campaign has been played out on two levels. On the one hand, absolutely the most contentious element of these debates revolves around the status of an organisation or a sort of proto-organisation called Momentum, which is still in the process of being constituted, but which has set itself the task I just referred to of transforming the campaign to elect Jeremy Corbyn leader into a wider political movement. And I'll come back to this in a moment. On the other hand, as I argued in a recent essay for Open Democracy, a website, Corbyn and his supporters clearly see his primary role as leader as being to rally, cohere and build a progressive social movement, even to transform the Labour Party itself into the vehicle for such a movement, rather than that role being primarily to campaign for Labour victories in local and national elections. On the other hand, Corbyn's centrist critics, including almost any legitimacy at all to any form of politics which is based on the building and mobilisation of movements. In particular, the really terrified reaction to Momentum amongst large sections of the political class and the sort of centre-left of the political class has been extremely telling. So, I mean, Momentum, as it exists at the moment, isn't really anything. It's a kind of hypothetical notion of an organisation which is in the process of being constituted. It's essentially a network of Facebook groups and kind of local meetings, and its only activity has been to mobilise a national voter registration drive. I mean, pretty innocuous activity. And yet it's been reported widely in the press and by sections of the Parliamentary Labour Party as a kind of neo-Trotskyist conspiracy to take over the Labour Party and to terrorise the entire political class, really, to terrorise certainly the Parliamentary Labour Party and sympathetic journalists into some submission to some sort of unspecified form of authority. I think I'm not sure it's going to take too long. Hang on. I've got links to some kind of. Maybe I'll come to the links later if there's time. Now, the press discourse. The press discourse on this issue emerged strongly over the summer of 2015, with the mobilisation of a particular set of explanations for the emergence of Corbyn as a serious contender for the Labour leadership. Again, I know there's most people here I know from Britain, some are not, so the kind of international comparison I always try to give is, Labour, Corbyn winning the leadership of the Labour Party seemed probably more unlikely than, say, Bernie Sanders actually getting the Democratic nomination in America, just sort of 6 months ago. It's kind of a huge surprise to everybody. And, the need to offer some kind of explanatory account of why it happens has been pretty widely felt. Now, the press discourse which emerged on this issue over the summer of 2015 it was pretty interesting to think about. I think the first significant trope of this discourse was the so-called echo chamber narrative, which attributed emergent Corbynism to a supposed tendency of social media to facilitate distinctive groups, immediately reinforcing their shared prejudices while distancing themselves from any wider public. So we are told Twitter and Facebook, which were clearly the key sites at which this mobilisation was occurring on some level, were echo chambers. They were places people just talk to other people like them, and they kind of convince themselves of the reality of their own positions. What's particularly interesting here, I think, is a certain slippage in the deployment of this trope, which I think, I haven't been able to check this properly, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. It was initially mobilised in order to dismiss Corbyn's chances of actually winning the leadership. So the narrative was that his supporters were encouraging others in the delusion that he might actually win, whereas actually, when it came to it, the Labour Party couldn't possibly be so stupid as actually to elect him. And when they did elect him, this kind of trope was shifted in its implications as a means of condemning as irrational the very act of electing him at all. And in both cases, this account tended to be linked to a sort of psychologising narrative, which in the classic tradition of social psychology, going all the way back to Thomas Hobbes, attributed support for Corbyn on the part of his partisans purely to an irrational identification with Corbyn and a desire to express their cultural identity as members of a virtuous sect, rather than to any kind of rational reasons they could be imagined for supporting him. Now, I'd like to point out, as I did in another essay for Open Democracy in July, that personally I would normally be expected to have a particular sympathy for this type of explanation. On the one hand, it resonates closely with the critique of what I called in a book in 2008, what I called the activist imaginary. And I made a very similar critique of radical activists, precisely the kind of people Phil was talking about actually, who displayed no inherent apparent interest in actually propagating their views among a wider public. On the other hand, the critique of the so-called echo chamber is normally predicated on a supposed commitment both to civic pluralism and to a kind of Gramscian politics based on broad-based coalitions, which are both things which I, like many of us here, have professed public commitments to many times and at every available opportunity. And it's with this in mind that I would assert here again that these explanations, which, as I say, you might kind of normally and normatively indeed expect me to be sympathetic to, are simply inadequate and demonstrably inaccurate accounts of what has motivated large sections of Corbyn's support, which clearly has a rational basis for as many of his supporters, relatively few of whom have any prior identification with the radical left, in general, or the Bennite tradition in the Labour Party, which he comes from in particular. These are also historical accounts which fail to register the very significant, well, they're ahistorical accounts rather, which fail to register the very significant generational shift which has taken place among radical activists, with a large-scale reorientation to the sphere of party politics taking place in a very short time over the past year, after almost 30 years of hostility and indifference to party politics in general. At the same time, the rhetoric which has attended these critical accounts of Corbynism is very telling of the actual assumptions and discursive traditions which they draw on. So I don't think I've got time to show you the link, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, described Momentum as a rabble. What's the guy who's just been sacked as Shadow Culture Secretary? What's his name? Yeah, Mark Duger described them as a mob. Well, this is a language which should be familiar to many of us. This is precisely the language of anti-democratic sentiment going back centuries. In fact, this kind of general castigation of a body which has so far done nothing more than trying to register voters, I think ultimately bespeaks a fundamentally anti-democratic set of assumptions and prejudices. At the same time, the fear of what we might call the digital mob is arguably a persistent feature of recent elite discourse on social media, perhaps exemplified by the extraordinary inflation of scare stories around the supposed campaign against the high-profile Labour MP Stella Creasy in my own constituency of Walthamstow. I'm not talking about the kind of Twitter campaign against her a couple of years ago. I'm talking about the entirely fictitious attempt to deselect her in Walthamstow. Now, this is all pretty familiar stuff to some extent. the presentation of any form of collective action or any genuinely democratic demands as deplorable disorder and dangerous mob rule goes all the way back to Plato, never mind Hobbes. I think what shocked many observers this year has been the extent to which even the left liberal sections of the mainstream media in the UK have joined in with this general denunciation of democracy. The Guardian editorial position in particular has mirrored the politics of the Parliamentary Labour Party to an uncanny extent. In both cases, a duty to defend a certain elite liberal orthodoxy has been asserted over any claims that members or readers may have to fair representation of their views. Now, what conclusions, if any, are we able to draw from these various observations? One I'd suggest is that we're clearly living through some kind of transitional period when the capacity of neoliberalism to assert its hegemonic authority over more or less the entire population, one way or another, seems to have been decisively lost. I mean, we're not in a period, there isn't an effective counter-hegemonic alternative at the moment, but for 30 years we had a situation in which even the most left-wing section of the broad electorate and its political representatives more or less accepted that neoliberalism could not be challenged publicly. That is clearly over, at least for the time being. The metropolitan left, which contrary to Blairite mythology, I think represents at least a good 20 to 25% of the electorate. I mean, the Blairites thought it was like nobody, has re-emerged after 3 decades of acquiescence following the great defeats of the mid-80s. And both the media and the political class are understandably struggling to accommodate themselves to the facts. That re-emergence and the dilemmas it poses, I think, provide good evidence for a number of classic and recent hypotheses which have been important for or hotly contested within media, cultural and communication studies. On the other hand, I do think they do demonstrate, against the understandable scepticism of many critics, the real capacity of social media to enable new configurations of collective agency, as scholars such as Joss Hand and Paolo Gabardo have explored in recent work, and as theorists like Hart and Negri and others have been suggesting for some years. On the other hand, they also demonstrate that the paradoxes of effective politics identified by Gramscian and neo-Gramscian theorists and analysts in the 70s, 80s and 90s have not gone away at all and remain central to any understanding of contemporary forms of politics and culture. Potent collectivities, communities in action, can now function effectively in distributed fashion and organised around issues and interests which it was previously very difficult for them to organise around. On the other hand, contrary to the claim made by some commentators that we now live in a post-hegemonic culture, the basic dilemma of hegemony and counter-hegemony, the question of how to balance the need to cohere and motivate one's own constituency with the need to extend and broaden its political and social coalition, remains the fundamental one at the heart of all effective political mobilisation.
I feel, stimulated by what's gone before, and I hope to build on it, but in a questioning way, because I don't have a complete answer to the kinds of questions that I'm posing, which are very similar to Jeremy's. So this theme, community and activism, when I was asked to speak, I thought, well, that sounds good. And then in the lumbering up process, thinking, what on earth can I focus on? I mean, it's such a huge sort of issue. And Agnes and also Natalie Fenton suggested, well, just link it to what you're already preoccupied with. And I have to say, a bit like with Jeremy, I'm preoccupied increasingly by political questions.